Chapter 15. Lease Options. Lease options and rent-to-own techniques are excellent marketing tools, and can be very beneficial for both parties. Before using either of these plans, I recommend you check with your tax accountant, or someone that is familiar with these marketing methods. I know people that are doing both lease options and rent-to-own, with good results. But the IRS does have certain rules and guidelines that must be followed in order for it to be considered a lease option, or rent-to-own. If you fail to follow their rules, you could run into a problem that might cause the IRS to say your lease option was really a sale. If that should happen, you would be taxed as a dealer on your transaction. We have not personally done either a lease option, or a rent-to-own with mobile homes. All of our mobile homes are sold and the title transferred into our buyer's name, for the simple reason that I don't want to be in the landlord business anymore. However, we did sell a number of our rental houses using the lease option system, and it worked out very well for both the tenant buyers, and for us. So, with that in mind, let's do some supposing. Lease option versus selling. Suppose instead of selling the home, you decide to offer your tenant buyer a lease option or rent-to-own plan. They both mean about the same, but your tenant buyer might be more familiar and feel more comfortable if you use the rent-to-own term. Either plan gives them the right to buy, but they are not obligated to buy. 157. With either method they would simply have the right to buy that home at some future date, provided they fulfilled the terms of the agreement. Let's see how we can structure a lease option that would still put the same amount of money in our pockets as a sale would, but minimize the taxes we pay. Using our previous example, suppose we sold the home for $5,000, with $500 down and financed $4,500 at 12.75%, $175.96 for 30 months. By selling the home, we have to show a $2,000 gain, profit, and pay taxes on the entire $2,000 in the year of sale, even though we only received $500 for a down payment. Not a cheerful thought, huh? Now, let's see how we would come out if we do a lease option instead of a sale. If we had sold the home, the total amount of our payments would be $5,278, plus the down payment of $500, for a total payout of $5,778. But, suppose we find a tenant buyer that agrees to pay $500 as option consideration and pay $200 each month for 28 months. At the end of 28 months, our tenant buyer agrees to also pay $500, and we will transfer the title to them. They would then own the home, the same as if we had originally sold it to them. If we add up the $500 option consideration payment, plus the 28 monthly payments, plus the $500 buyout payment at the end, we see that we will have collected a total of $6,600, $822 more than we would have collected had we sold the home. Since we would be responsible for paying the taxes and insurance, this additional $822 should be enough to pay those fees when they come due. So you should make the payments higher on a lease option than on a sale, for that reason. Since we are doing a lease option instead of a sale, the $500 option consideration payment wouldn't be taxed until the option was either exercised or expires. The monthly payments, 158, we receive would be considered rent, and we would pay taxes only on the amount received in that year. If our tenant buyer should decide not to exercise their option and move, they would not be entitled to any rebate for any payments made. All payments would be treated as rent. A lease option can be an excellent marketing tool with many benefits for both buyer and seller, if done right. But be sure you follow the IRS regulations. One of the requirements, as I understand it, is that the final buyout payment at the end of the term of the option must be at least 10% of the fair market value of the home. In our example, the home had a fair market price of $5,000, so the final payment of $500 would meet that requirement. Follow the rules. I have heard of cases where the seller would agree to let the tenant buyer make a certain number of payments, and when the last payment was made, the tenant buyer would pay a token amount of $1, or some very small amount, and the home would be theirs. I don't recommend you do this, because it's very likely that the IRS will say that you really made a sale, not a lease option. If that should be the case, you would then be taxed as if you had made a sale. Check with your tax advisor before you do a lease option so you won't violate any of the IRS regulations. By doing a lease option, you are actually in the rental business, so you should realize that you would need to carry proper insurance on the home. You would also be required to have the home titled in your name and pay the taxes and insurance premiums. Since you will be responsible for paying the taxes and insurance, your note should be structured so that the payments are more than they would be had you sold the home. 159. Figure what the taxes and insurance will cost each year and make the monthly payments enough to cover it. That's why I set the payment at $200 instead of $176. The difference should cover the taxes and insurance. You might consider trying a couple of lease option deals to see if you like that better than selling the home. There are some advantages with renting that you don't get by selling. For instance, you can deduct any taxes, insurance premiums and any expenses related to the home. You can also depreciate the cost of the home, but on these cheapo deals, it's nothing to get excited about. The depreciation must be spread over 27.5 years, so you're only talking $100 per year, or less. Minimize trouble calls. If you do a lease option, I recommend that you structure your agreement so that you eliminate trouble calls from your tenant buyer as much as possible. A good way to do that is to make your tenant buyer responsible for all maintenance and repairs during the option period. That's the way we handled it when we leased optioned our rental houses, and it kept the trouble calls to a minimum. Explain to your tenant buyer that the reason you are able to offer them a chance to buy that home for the same amount they would be paying in rent, is because you can't be bothered with trouble calls, or pay for any repairs. And also, that if you should have to make any repairs, or spend any money on the home during the term of the option, it will be added to the purchase price. This should cut out most of the common tenant complaints and trouble calls. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter and see what happens when they don't pay.